inside you quietly admits that transformation doesn't announce itself with thunder. It whispers in the quiet moments when you realize the life you're living doesn't quite match the person you know you could become. Maybe you've felt that moment before. You're sitting alone late at night, scrolling through your phone, and suddenly there's this uncomfortable thought that appears out of nowhere. Is this really the best version of me? You look at your habits, your reactions, the way you spend your time, and something inside you quietly admits that you're capable of more. Not in some dramatic, movie-like way, but in the small decisions you make every single day. The truth is, most people never act on that moment. They feel the discomfort, promise themselves they'll change tomorrow, and then drift right back into the same routines, the same distractions, the same comfortable patterns that slowly keep them stuck. But the Stoics warned us about this centuries ago. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that a person's life is shaped not by what happens around them, but by how they choose to respond to it. That means the difference between the life you're living now and the life you could build often comes down to something surprisingly simple: the willingness to change your habits, your thinking, and the way you face discomfort. So if that journey toward clarity, discipline, and self-mastery speaks to you, consider subscribing. Not as a favor to me, but as a quiet commitment to yourself, a reminder that every day you're choosing wisdom over noise and growth over comfort. Part 1. The moment you realize you can become someone completely different. There is a quiet moment most people experience at least once in their lives, although many try to ignore it because it feels uncomfortable and inconvenient. It usually happens late at night when the noise of the day fades and your mind finally slows down enough to think clearly. You sit there, maybe scrolling through your phone, maybe staring at the ceiling, and a strange thought appears that you cannot easily dismiss. The thought is simple but powerful. What if I could become someone completely different from who I am today? Not by pretending to be someone else, not by changing your appearance, but by slowly transforming the way you think, the way you react, the way you move through life. In that moment, you sense that the life you are currently living might only be a small fraction of what you are capable of creating. Most people push that thought away almost immediately. They tell themselves they are too busy, too tired, or too stuck in their current situation to change anything meaningful. They convince themselves that transformation belongs to other people, people with more talent, more discipline, or better circumstances. But the ancient Stoics believed something very different. They believed that the greatest power any human being possesses is the ability to reshape their inner world. Marcus Aurelius wrote a line to himself that still resonates centuries later. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Those words carry a simple but radical truth. The external world will always be unpredictable. Circumstances will change, people will disappoint you, plans will fail, and unexpected problems will appear. Yet the way you interpret and respond to those events remains under your control. Think about how often people try to change their lives by rearranging external circumstances while leaving their thinking untouched. Someone decides that a new job will solve their frustration, but they carry the same habits and attitudes into the new workplace. Someone moves to a different city hoping for a fresh start, yet the same patterns quietly follow them. Someone promises themselves that next year will finally be different, but they wake up each day repeating the same routine that produced the current version of their life. The Stoics would say that this approach misunderstands where real transformation begins. The foundation of change is not the environment around you, but the discipline within you. Modern psychology echoes this ancient insight. Carl Jung once observed that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. What Jung meant is that many of our behaviors are guided by hidden assumptions and automatic reactions that we rarely question. We believe we are making free choices, but in reality, we are often repeating patterns that were formed years earlier through habit, fear, or conditioning. True transformation begins when you start paying attention to those patterns. When you notice how you react to criticism, how you handle discomfort, how you speak to yourself during moments of doubt, you begin to see the architecture of your inner world. And once you see that architecture, something remarkable becomes possible. You realize that the person you are today is not a fixed identity, but a collection of repeated thoughts and actions. Change those patterns, and the identity itself begins to shift. This is why the Stoics emphasize daily self-examination. Seneca described a habit he practiced every evening before going to sleep. He would review the day and ask himself questions like, what weakness did I overcome today? What mistake did I make? What could I do better tomorrow? Notice the spirit of that exercise. It is not about harsh self-judgment or guilt. It is about honest awareness. When you observe your actions clearly, you create the possibility of improving them. Imagine two people who experience the same difficult day. Both encounter frustration, criticism, and setbacks. The first person reacts automatically. They complain, blame circumstances, and carry the negativity into the evening. The second person pauses and reflects. They ask themselves what they could learn from the situation. The external events were identical, but the internal response created two entirely different outcomes. Over time, those responses compound. One life drifts deeper into frustration, while the other gradually becomes stronger and more disciplined. This is where the Stoic path begins to reveal its quiet power. Stoicism is not about suppressing emotions or pretending that life is easy. It is about training the mind so that emotions do not control your actions. It teaches you to pause before reacting, to question the stories your mind creates, and to align your behavior with your deeper values rather than momentary impulses. That discipline slowly reshapes your character. It turns the scattered, reactive version of you into someone calmer, more deliberate, and more resilient. If you observe people who appear mentally strong, you will notice that their strength rarely announces itself with loud confidence or dramatic gestures. Instead, it shows up in small behaviors. They listen more than they speak. They respond thoughtfully instead of reacting impulsively. They keep commitments even when motivation fades. Over months and years, those small behaviors accumulate until the person becomes almost unrecognizable compared to their earlier self. This transformation does not happen overnight. It happens quietly through consistent effort. The idea of becoming unrecognizable might sound extreme at first, but it simply means evolving beyond the patterns that once limited you. Imagine the version of yourself who used to procrastinate constantly, but gradually develops the habit of acting immediately on important tasks. Imagine the person who once avoided difficult conversations, learning to speak honestly and calmly. Imagine someone who used to be overwhelmed by anxiety, learning to observe their thoughts without being controlled by them. None of these changes require extraordinary talent. They require patience, awareness, and the willingness to practice new behaviors repeatedly. One of the most powerful aspects of Stoic philosophy is its emphasis on practical application. These ideas were never meant to remain abstract theories. The Stoics believed philosophy should function like a training system for the mind, similar to how exercise strengthens the body. Epictetus often reminded his students that philosophy is not about discussing ideas endlessly, but about living them. In his view, a person who studies philosophy but fails to apply it is like someone who reads books about health while refusing to move their body. This practical approach becomes especially relevant in the modern world, where distraction constantly pulls our attention in different directions. Notifications, social media feeds, and endless streams of information make it easy to spend entire days reacting rather than thinking deliberately. Without realizing it, people begin to outsource their focus to whatever stimulus appears next. The Stoics would argue that reclaiming your attention is the first step toward reclaiming your life. Consider how often your day is shaped by impulses instead of intentions. You wake up and immediately reach for your phone. You check messages, scroll through news headlines, glance at social media updates. Before you know it, 30 minutes have passed and your mind is already scattered. That scattered state follows you through the rest of the morning. You jump from one task to another, responding to whatever seems urgent rather than focusing on what truly matters. By evening you feel busy yet strangely unfulfilled. The Stoic approach offers a different rhythm. Instead of starting the day with distraction, it begins with reflection. Instead of reacting automatically, it encourages deliberate action. Over time, this shift changes not only your productivity, but your sense of identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who governs their attention rather than someone who is constantly pulled by external demands. Carl Jung once wrote a sentence that captures this transformation beautifully. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. At first glance, that line might seem obvious. But becoming who you truly are requires peeling away layers of fear, habit, and expectation that accumulated over many years. It requires examining the stories you tell yourself about your abilities and limitations. It requires confronting the comfortable routines that keep you from growing. The Stoics believed that this process is both challenging and liberating. Challenging because it forces you to take responsibility for your choices. Liberating because it reveals that your future is not predetermined by your past. Each day offers a new opportunity to practice different behaviors and strengthen different qualities. Courage can be trained. Patience can be trained. Discipline can be trained. Imagine looking back at your life 1 year from now and realizing that you handle pressure differently. You think more clearly during conflict. You no longer waste energy arguing about trivial matters. Your habits support your goals rather than undermining them. Friends and colleagues notice the change. They might not be able to explain exactly what happened, but they sense that you have developed a quiet confidence that was not present before. This transformation is exactly what the Stoics meant when they spoke about shaping character. They understood that the person you become is built through daily decisions. Each time you pause instead of reacting, you strengthen patience. Each time you complete a difficult task, despite discomfort, you strengthen discipline. Each time you choose honesty over convenience, you strengthen integrity. Over time, those qualities accumulate until the new version of you feels almost natural. What once required effort becomes habit. What once felt intimidating becomes routine. That is the moment when you realize you have crossed an invisible threshold. The old patterns no longer define you. The new patterns have taken their place. In the next sections of this discussion, we will explore 5 Stoic practices that can guide this transformation. These practices are simple but powerful. They involve mastering silence, rebuilding daily rituals, evaluating the people and environments that influence you, embracing discomfort as a training ground, and rewriting the internal narrative that shapes your decisions. Each of these principles builds upon the others, gradually creating a stronger and more resilient mindset. As you continue listening, remember that transformation is not about perfection. The Stoics themselves were not perfect. They were students of their own philosophy, constantly refining their behavior and learning from mistakes. The goal is not to eliminate every weakness overnight, but to move steadily in a direction that aligns with your highest values. The moment you realize that such growth is possible marks the beginning of a new chapter. You no longer see yourself as a fixed identity shaped by circumstances. You begin to see yourself as an evolving project, someone capable of learning, adapting, and becoming stronger over time. That shift in perspective alone can change the trajectory of your life. And perhaps the most encouraging aspect of this journey is that it does not require dramatic resources or extraordinary talent. It requires attention. It requires honesty. And it requires the courage to practice small improvements day after day. Those improvements may seem insignificant at first, but they accumulate quietly until the difference becomes undeniable. The Stoics often compared personal development to carving a sculpture from stone. Each strike of the chisel removes a small piece, revealing the form hidden inside. At the beginning, the progress is barely noticeable, but with patience and persistence, the shape gradually emerges. In the same way, every disciplined choice removes a fragment of the habits that once held you back. One day you look at your life and realize that the sculpture has taken shape. The person standing there is calmer, clearer, and stronger than the one who began the process. That realization does not arrive with dramatic music or applause. It arrives quietly, like a whisper confirming that the work you have done inside yourself has finally begun to show on the outside. And that quiet transformation is exactly what Stoicism was always about. Part 2. Master the power of controlled silence. One of the most underrated forms of strength is the ability to remain silent when every instinct inside you wants to react. Most people never develop this skill because reacting feels natural. When someone criticizes you, the immediate impulse is to defend yourself. When someone disagrees with you, the instinct is to argue your point. When someone disrespects you, the urge to prove them wrong rises almost instantly. These reactions feel automatic because they are. They are habits your mind learned long ago, often before you were even aware that different responses were possible. Yet the Stoics believed that the space between stimulus and response is where real freedom exists. That small pause, the moment when you choose not to react impulsively, can completely change the direction of a conversation, a relationship, or even your entire day. Epictetus often reminded his students that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. While this line may sound simple, its deeper meaning touches on a profound psychological truth. When you learn to observe before reacting, you gain insight that reactive people never see. Think about the last time you were involved in a heated conversation. Perhaps someone questioned your judgment, or maybe a disagreement escalated quickly because both sides felt the need to defend themselves. In that moment, emotions move faster than logic. Words spill out that later feel unnecessary or even regrettable. The conversation becomes less about understanding and more about winning. Silence, however, interrupts that cycle. When you choose not to respond immediately, you create space for your thinking mind to catch up with your emotional impulse. Marcus Aurelius wrote reminders to himself about this very habit. He often reflected on the importance of remaining calm when others acted irrationally. Instead of allowing their behavior to dictate his response, he reminded himself that the character of another person could never damage his own unless he allowed it. This mindset shifts the focus from controlling others to controlling yourself. Modern psychology supports this perspective as well. Emotional regulation, the ability to pause before acting on impulse, is widely considered one of the most important traits associated with long-term success and healthy relationships. When you resist the urge to react instantly, you allow your brain to move from the emotional centers toward the reasoning centers. In simple terms, silence gives your intelligence time to participate in the conversation. Carl Jung expressed a related idea when he wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." This insight becomes easier to grasp when you practice silence. Instead of reacting defensively to criticism, you can observe your own response. Why did that comment bother you so much? Is there some truth hidden inside it? Or is the reaction coming from an old insecurity that has nothing to do with the present moment? Silence gives you the opportunity to examine these questions rather than drowning them out with immediate rebuttals. In daily life, this skill often appears in small situations. Imagine a coworker questioning your decision during a meeting. The reactive version of you might interrupt quickly, trying to defend your reasoning before fully hearing their perspective. The disciplined version listens carefully, considers the feedback, and responds calmly if necessary. Sometimes you might even discover that the criticism contained useful insight. By staying silent long enough to process it, you avoid turning a potentially helpful conversation into a defensive argument. Another example appears in personal relationships. Many conflicts between friends or partners escalate because both people speak from emotion rather than reflection. Words become weapons rather than tools for understanding. Yet, when one person chooses silence, even briefly, the emotional temperature of the situation begins to drop. That pause communicates something powerful. You are more interested in clarity than in winning the argument. Silence also carries a second advantage that many people underestimate. It allows you to observe others more clearly. When you are constantly speaking, your attention remains focused on your own thoughts. When you listen quietly, however, you begin to notice subtle details about the other person's motivations, tone, and intentions. You see patterns that reactive conversation hides. This ability to observe without immediately reacting was highly valued by Stoic thinkers. They believed that understanding human nature required patience and attention. When you watch how people behave during moments of stress, disagreement, or temptation, you gain insight into their character. This knowledge can guide your own responses in future situations. Another aspect of controlled silence involves protecting your mental energy. In modern life, countless opportunities for pointless arguments appear every day. Social media discussions, political debates, workplace gossip, and minor misunderstandings can easily pull you into conversations that lead nowhere productive. Each of these interactions consumes attention and emotional energy. The Stoics believed that energy should be reserved for actions aligned with your values, not wasted on disputes that change nothing. Consider how often people feel exhausted after arguing online or defending themselves in trivial debates. The conversation ends, yet the emotional residue remains. Thoughts replay in your mind long after the interaction ends. Silence prevents this cycle. When you decline to engage with unnecessary negativity, you preserve your attention for pursuits that actually matter. This does not mean becoming passive or avoiding every difficult conversation. Stoicism does not encourage silence when truth or justice requires speaking. Instead, it encourages intentional speech. Words should be chosen carefully, delivered calmly, and used only when they contribute to understanding or improvement. The difference between reactive speech and intentional speech is enormous. One spreads chaos, while the other builds clarity. Seneca once wrote that wise speech resembles medicine. It should be measured and purposeful rather than excessive. When you adopt this perspective, you begin to treat your words as valuable tools rather than impulsive reactions. Silence becomes the preparation that ensures those tools are used effectively. Over time, the practice of controlled silence changes how others perceive you as well. People begin to notice that you do not react to every provocation. They realize that when you speak, your words carry weight because they are not constant or careless. Conversations with you feel calmer and more thoughtful. In many cases, this quiet presence naturally commands respect without demanding it. But perhaps the most important transformation happens internally. As you grow comfortable with silence, you become more familiar with your own thoughts. The constant noise of reaction fades, revealing deeper reflections beneath the surface. You begin to notice patterns in your thinking, recurring fears, and habitual assumptions that once operated unnoticed. This awareness creates the possibility of change. Carl Jung suggested that self-knowledge begins with observing the inner dialogue that usually remains hidden beneath daily activity. Silence provides the environment where this observation becomes possible. When external noise decreases, internal clarity increases. Practicing controlled silence does not require dramatic lifestyle changes. It begins with small decisions throughout the day. The next time someone interrupts you or challenges your opinion, resist the urge to respond instantly. Take a breath and listen carefully to what they are actually saying. Notice your emotional reaction without acting on it immediately. In that brief pause, you reclaim control over your response. Another opportunity appears when you feel tempted to explain yourself excessively. Many people waste energy defending every choice they make, hoping others will understand or approve. Yet constant explanation often invites more criticism rather than resolving it. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply to continue your actions without providing justification. Your behavior will eventually speak louder than any argument. Over time, these small acts of restraint accumulate. The person who once reacted impulsively begins to move through life with greater composure. Situations that previously triggered frustration now become opportunities to practice patience. Conflicts that once escalated quickly now dissolve before gaining momentum. This transformation is subtle but profound. You do not become silent in every situation, nor do you withdraw from meaningful conversations. Instead, you develop the ability to choose when speaking is necessary and when silence is wiser. That ability represents a form of self-mastery that the Stoics considered essential to a disciplined life. And as this mastery grows, something else happens quietly in the background. Your thoughts become clearer. Your words become more intentional. Your presence becomes calmer. The version of yourself that once reacted instantly begins to fade, replaced by someone who responds with deliberation and awareness. This is the first visible step toward becoming unrecognizable to your former self. In the next part of our discussion, we will explore another Stoic principle that supports this transformation. The deliberate reconstruction of your daily rituals, because once you begin mastering your reactions, the next challenge is shaping the habits that define your everyday life. Part 3. Rebuild your daily rituals from the ground up. Once you begin mastering your reactions and learning the power of silence, the next transformation naturally moves toward something more practical and visible. The structure of your daily life. Most people underestimate how much their routines shape their identity. They assume that who they are is determined by personality, circumstances, or talent. But the Stoics would say that a person's character is largely built from the habits they repeat every day. If you want to become someone new, the most effective place to begin is not with grand plans, but with the quiet rituals that guide your mornings, afternoons, and evenings. Think about the rhythm of an average day. Many people wake up already feeling rushed. The alarm rings, the mind is foggy, and before even standing up, the phone is already in their hands. Messages, notifications, and social media updates fill the first few minutes of consciousness. By the time they step out of bed, their mind is already scattered across dozens of unrelated thoughts. That scattered energy continues throughout the day. Tasks are started without clear intention. Breaks are filled with distractions rather than rest. By evening, exhaustion arrives not only from work, but from the constant fragmentation of attention. The Stoics believed that such a lifestyle slowly erodes clarity and discipline. Seneca warned that people often live as if time were infinite, spending their days carelessly and then wondering why their lives feel rushed and incomplete. In one of his reflections, he observed that it is not that we have too little time, but that we waste much of it without realizing how valuable it is. When you begin examining your routines honestly, you may discover that many hours disappear each day through habits that contribute nothing to your growth or well-being. Rebuilding your rituals begins with recognizing this simple truth: every day is a training ground. The actions you repeat today quietly shape the person you will become tomorrow. If your daily habits encourage distraction, procrastination, and emotional reactivity, those qualities gradually become part of your character. But if your habits support clarity, discipline, and thoughtful action, those traits begin to grow stronger with each repetition. Marcus Aurelius wrote personal reminders about this principle in his journal. He often urged himself to rise early and face the responsibilities of the day with determination rather than laziness. For him, the morning was not simply the beginning of another routine, but an opportunity to practice virtue. He believed that every sunrise presented a chance to strengthen qualities like patience, courage, and self-control. The discipline of starting the day intentionally was, in his mind, a way of honoring the potential each day contained. Modern psychology reinforces this Stoic insight in a different language. Researchers studying habit formation have discovered that repeated behaviors eventually become automatic. Once a habit is established, it requires far less mental effort to maintain. This means that the routines you establish today can either support your long-term goals or silently sabotage them. A single morning routine may seem insignificant, but repeated hundreds of times it becomes a powerful force shaping your identity. Consider the difference between two mornings. In the first scenario, the alarm rings and the phone immediately takes your attention. 10 minutes of scrolling turn into 20. The mind absorbs a mixture of news headlines, opinions, and images that provoke comparison or irritation. By the time the day begins, your attention is already scattered. In the second scenario, the morning begins quietly. Instead of reaching for the phone, you take a few moments to breathe deeply and become aware of your surroundings. Perhaps you stretch your body or take a short walk. You read a few pages of a thoughtful book or write a brief reflection about the day ahead. These actions take only minutes, yet they establish a completely different mental environment. The Stoics would describe this difference as the contrast between living reactively and living deliberately. A reactive day begins with external influences pulling your attention in multiple directions. A deliberate day begins with you setting the direction before the world demands your response. Over time, this small difference compounds. The person who begins each day intentionally gradually develops stronger focus, clearer priorities, and greater resilience. Carl Jung once observed that your vision will become clear only when you look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens. Morning rituals provide an opportunity for this inward reflection. Instead of immediately absorbing the opinions and emotions of the outside world, you spend a few moments examining your own thoughts. What kind of person do you want to be today? How will you respond to challenges that may appear? What qualities do you want to practice in your interactions with others? These questions do not require long periods of meditation or elaborate planning. Even a brief moment of reflection can influence the tone of the entire day. By reminding yourself of your values before facing the day's demands, you create a mental compass that helps guide your decisions. When difficulties arise later, that earlier reflection provides a reference point for how you want to respond. Daily rituals also include how you manage your attention throughout the day. Many people attempt to multitask constantly, believing they are increasing productivity. In reality, this habit often fragments focus and reduces the quality of their work. The Stoics encouraged the opposite approach, full attention to the task at hand. When you concentrate fully on one activity, you develop not only efficiency, but also a sense of calm engagement. Imagine working on an important project while notifications constantly interrupt your focus. Each interruption forces your mind to shift attention and then slowly rebuild concentration. The result is mental fatigue and incomplete thinking. Now imagine working in a quieter environment where you dedicate uninterrupted blocks of time to the same project. The difference in clarity and productivity becomes obvious. This practice of focused attention aligns closely with Stoic discipline because it trains the mind to resist unnecessary distractions. Even the evening offers an opportunity for reflection and improvement. Seneca recommended reviewing the events of the day before going to sleep. This habit allows you to recognize both successes and mistakes without harsh judgment. Perhaps you handled a difficult conversation with patience. Perhaps you allowed frustration to influence your reaction in another situation. By observing these moments honestly, you prepare yourself to respond differently the next time similar circumstances arise. This evening reflection also encourages gratitude. When you review your day carefully, you begin noticing small positive experiences that might otherwise be forgotten. A helpful conversation, a moment of progress in your work, or even a quiet walk outdoors becomes part of the day's memory. Recognizing these moments shifts your perspective from constant dissatisfaction to a balanced awareness of both challenges and opportunities. Rebuilding your rituals does not require a dramatic transformation of your schedule. In fact, attempting too many changes at once often leads to frustration and abandonment. The Stoic approach favors gradual improvement. Start with 1 or 2 small practices that align with your values. Perhaps you decide to begin each morning with 5 minutes of reflection before checking your phone. Perhaps you set aside 10 minutes each evening to review your day and plan the next one. These actions may seem modest, but consistency gives them power. Over weeks and months, these rituals begin to reshape your sense of identity. You no longer see yourself as someone drifting through days guided by external pressures. Instead, you become someone who structures their time intentionally. Friends and colleagues may notice subtle differences. You appear calmer, more focused, and less reactive. The change did not occur through dramatic declarations, but through quiet repetition. Another Stoic principle supports this process: the idea that character is built through practice. Virtue is not something you possess automatically, it is something you strengthen through repeated action. Each time you choose discipline over distraction, patience over irritation, or reflection over impulsiveness, you reinforce the qualities you admire. Eventually, the cumulative effect of these rituals becomes unmistakable. Tasks that once required effort begin to feel natural. You wake with clearer purpose. You manage your attention more carefully. You end each day with a better understanding of your actions and intentions. The person you were before beginning these practices begins to feel distant, almost like a previous version of yourself. This transformation may not appear dramatic from the outside, but internally it represents a profound shift. You have moved from living reactively to living deliberately. Your days are no longer shaped entirely by circumstances, but guided by principles you have chosen consciously. And this is precisely how Stoicism approaches personal change. It does not promise instant results or effortless success. Instead, it offers a path of steady improvement through disciplined habits and thoughtful reflection. Over time, those habits accumulate until they create a life that feels both purposeful and resilient. As you continue applying these ideas, another important realization often emerges. The environment around you, including the people you interact with regularly, can either support or undermine your growth. The Stoics understood that relationships influence character more deeply than many people realize. In the next part of our discussion, we will explore how evaluating your environment and the company you keep can accelerate your transformation or quietly prevent it, because sometimes becoming a new version of yourself requires not only changing your habits, but also changing the influences that surround you. Part 4. Cut dead weight and protect your environment. There comes a moment in personal growth that feels uncomfortable but unavoidable. It is the moment when you begin to notice that not every environment, conversation, or relationship in your life supports the person you are trying to become. At first, this realization feels almost disloyal, as if questioning the influence of others somehow makes you ungrateful or arrogant. Yet the Stoics were very clear about this reality. The people and environments surrounding you quietly shape your habits, your thoughts, and eventually your character. If you want to transform yourself, you must pay careful attention to the influences you allow into your daily life. Most people underestimate how powerful social influence can be. Human beings naturally adapt to the behavior of those around them. If your closest circle values discipline, curiosity, and growth, you will gradually begin reflecting those qualities as well. If your environment revolves around distraction, complaints, and avoidance of responsibility, those patterns can easily become normal without you realizing it. Seneca warned about this subtle influence when he wrote that we often imitate the habits of the people we spend the most time with, just as certain illnesses can spread quietly through contact. His point was not that people themselves are harmful, but that habits and attitudes are contagious. Think about the conversations you hear most often in your daily life. Do they revolve around growth, ideas, and improvement, or do they revolve around gossip, negativity, and excuses? Conversations shape perspective more than we realize. If you repeatedly hear that success is impossible, that effort is pointless, or that discipline is unnecessary, those messages slowly become part of your thinking. On the other hand, when you spend time around people who challenge themselves and take responsibility for their choices, you begin to see life through a more empowered lens. This does not mean you must suddenly cut off everyone who disagrees with you or remove every imperfect relationship from your life. Stoicism encourages compassion and patience toward others, but it also emphasizes responsibility for your own development. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that while he could not control the actions of others, he could control how much influence those actions had over his own character. This distinction is important. You do not need to change people around you, but you must decide how closely you allow their habits and attitudes to shape your own. Sometimes protecting your environment simply means setting clearer boundaries. For example, you might notice that certain conversations always drift toward negativity or complaints. Instead of participating in that pattern, you can gently shift the topic or excuse yourself from the discussion. Over time, people begin to understand that you prefer constructive conversations rather than constant criticism or gossip. In many cases, this quiet shift earns respect rather than conflict. At other times, the adjustment may involve changing how you spend your time. If most of your free hours disappear into environments that encourage distraction rather than growth, it becomes difficult to maintain discipline. For instance, spending every evening surrounded by constant noise and social pressure may leave little space for reflection or learning. By intentionally choosing environments that support your goals, such as reading, exercising, or engaging in thoughtful discussion, you gradually reinforce the identity you are trying to build. Carl Jung spoke about this process when he suggested that individuals must sometimes separate themselves from familiar patterns in order to develop their true character. Growth often requires stepping away from influences that keep you tied to an earlier version of yourself. This step can feel lonely at first because familiarity provides comfort even when it limits progress. Yet solitude, when used wisely, can become a powerful teacher. In moments of quiet reflection, you begin hearing your own thoughts more clearly rather than absorbing the opinions of everyone around you. Another aspect of protecting your environment involves recognizing subtle forms of discouragement. Sometimes people unintentionally undermine your efforts by projecting their own doubts onto you. When you begin adopting new habits, such as waking earlier, studying regularly, or focusing more seriously on your goals, others may respond with skepticism. They might say you are working too hard, taking things too seriously, or trying to change too much. In many cases, these comments come not from malice, but from discomfort. Your growth reminds them of changes they might wish to make in their own lives. Stoicism teaches that such reactions should not provoke anger or resentment. Instead, they provide an opportunity to practice patience and self-awareness. The goal is not to convince everyone of your path, but to remain steady in it. When people see consistent action over time, many eventually respect the discipline they initially questioned. The most convincing argument for your growth is not explanation, but demonstration. Protecting your environment also means seeking influences that elevate your thinking. This might involve reading books that challenge your perspective, listening to conversations that expand your understanding, or surrounding yourself with individuals who value integrity and curiosity. These influences act like mental nourishment. Just as the body becomes stronger through healthy food, the mind becomes stronger through thoughtful ideas and meaningful dialogue. The Stoics believed that the quality of your attention determines the quality of your life. When you choose environments that encourage reflection, discipline, and learning, you create conditions where personal growth becomes easier. Gradually, the habits you once struggled to maintain begin feeling natural because the surrounding influences support them rather than resisting them. Over time, this process leads to a subtle but powerful shift. The version of yourself who once adapted automatically to every environment becomes someone who consciously shapes the environments they inhabit. You choose where to direct your energy, whom to learn from, and what conversations deserve your attention. This is not isolation, but intentional living. And as you continue developing this awareness, you begin noticing something encouraging. The more you protect your mental environment, the more clarity and confidence you gain in your decisions. That clarity prepares you for the next stage of transformation, learning to face discomfort deliberately rather than avoiding it. Because once your habits and surroundings support growth, the greatest remaining obstacle is often the fear of stepping beyond what feels safe and familiar. Part 5. Embrace discomfort and rewrite the story of your life. There is a moment in every journey of personal growth when the path stops feeling comfortable. At the beginning, change often feels exciting. You discover new ideas, new habits, new perspectives, and the promise of becoming stronger gives you a burst of motivation. But after the excitement fades, something else appears. Resistance. Suddenly, the habits feel harder to maintain. The discipline feels heavier than expected. The quiet voice inside your mind begins whispering that maybe the old way was easier after all. This moment is where most people turn back. They interpret discomfort as a sign that something is wrong. Yet, the Stoics understood something deeper. Discomfort is often the signal that transformation has begun. Human beings naturally seek comfort. It is part of our biological design to conserve energy and avoid risk. For thousands of years, this instinct helped our ancestors survive dangerous environments. But in the modern world, that same instinct can quietly limit our growth. When we always choose comfort, we avoid the very experiences that strengthen our character. Difficult conversations are postponed. Challenging opportunities are ignored. New skills are left unlearned because the first steps feel awkward or uncertain. Over time, the comfort zone becomes less like a safe space and more like a small cage built from familiar habits. The Stoic philosophers believed that stepping beyond this cage was essential for developing inner strength. Epictetus often taught that hardships are not simply unfortunate events, but opportunities to practice virtue. When you face difficulty with patience, courage, and discipline, you are training your character just as an athlete trains their body. Without resistance, muscles cannot grow stronger, and without challenges, the mind cannot develop resilience. What feels uncomfortable in the moment becomes the very experience that prepares you for greater challenges in the future. Consider how this idea appears in everyday life. Perhaps you have avoided speaking up about something important because you feared conflict. The longer you avoid the conversation, the more intimidating it becomes. Your mind begins creating stories about how badly the situation might unfold. Yet, when you finally gather the courage to address the issue honestly, something surprising happens. The discomfort you feared begins to fade once the conversation actually starts. You realize that the anticipation was far more painful than the action itself. In that moment, you learn an important lesson. Fear often grows larger in imagination than it is in reality. Marcus Aurelius reflected on this truth in his private writings. He reminded himself that many things we fear are simply products of our interpretation rather than the events themselves. When the mind labels something as unbearable, it becomes intimidating. When the mind views it as a challenge to be practiced, it becomes manageable. This shift in interpretation transforms discomfort from an enemy into a teacher. Modern psychology echoes this idea through the concept of cognitive framing. The way we interpret an event determines how we feel about it. If you believe a challenge proves that you are incapable, you will likely retreat from it. If you believe the same challenge is an opportunity to learn, your motivation to face it increases. The external situation remains identical, yet your response changes completely. The Stoics practiced this mental reframing centuries before psychologists gave it a name. Carl Jung expressed a similar insight when he wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Jung was describing the importance of confronting the uncomfortable parts of ourselves. Each person carries doubts, fears, and weaknesses that they would prefer to ignore. Yet those hidden elements continue influencing behavior until we bring them into awareness. When you face discomfort deliberately, you begin uncovering those hidden patterns. You see how fear has shaped your decisions and how hesitation has limited your possibilities. Embracing discomfort does not mean chasing pain or suffering for its own sake. Stoicism does not celebrate hardship as an end goal. Instead, it encourages thoughtful engagement with difficulty as a means of strengthening the mind. The idea is simple. When challenges appear, respond to them as training opportunities rather than personal attacks. A difficult task becomes a chance to practice perseverance. A disagreement becomes a chance to practice patience. A moment of uncertainty becomes a chance to practice courage. As you apply this mindset repeatedly, something remarkable begins to happen. Situations that once felt intimidating start feeling familiar. The conversation you once avoided becomes easier the second time you attempt it. The task that once felt overwhelming becomes manageable once you have practiced it several times. Your confidence grows not because the world becomes easier, but because you have become stronger. Yet there is another element of transformation that must accompany this willingness to face discomfort. It involves the story you tell yourself about your life. Every person carries an internal narrative, a running commentary that interprets events and assigns meaning to experiences. This narrative quietly influences decisions more than we realize. If the story inside your mind constantly repeats that you are unlucky, incapable, or destined to fail, those beliefs slowly shape your behavior. You hesitate before taking risks because the narrative predicts disappointment. Stoic philosophy challenges this narrative by reminding us that our judgments are within our control. We cannot control every event that happens, but we can control the meaning we attach to it. When a setback occurs, you can interpret it as proof of failure or as valuable feedback guiding your next step. The same experience can produce despair or determination, depending on the story you choose to believe. Seneca once compared adversity to fire that tests the strength of metal. Weak materials crumble, but strong ones become even more resilient after passing through the flames. This metaphor illustrates the Stoic perspective perfectly. Difficult experiences reveal the quality of our character and give us the chance to strengthen it. Instead of asking why hardship appeared, the Stoic asks how it can be used to improve their understanding and discipline. When you begin rewriting the narrative of your life in this way, your relationship with challenges changes dramatically. Instead of avoiding discomfort, you recognize it as a signal that you are moving beyond the boundaries of your previous self. Each challenge becomes a chapter in the story of your development rather than a setback that stops the journey. Over time, this shift creates a powerful transformation. The person who once doubted their ability to grow becomes someone who trusts the process of improvement. The voice inside your mind changes tone. Instead of criticizing every mistake, it begins encouraging progress. Instead of fearing obstacles, it begins searching for lessons within them. This new narrative becomes the foundation of resilience. As we reach the end of this discussion, remember that transformation rarely happens in dramatic bursts. More often, it unfolds quietly through repeated choices made with awareness. Choosing silence instead of reaction. Choosing disciplined rituals instead of careless habits. Choosing supportive environments instead of negative influences. Choosing growth over comfort. And choosing a narrative that empowers rather than limits you. Each of these choices may seem small in isolation, but together they create a life guided by intention rather than circumstance. Months from now, you may look back and realize that your thinking has changed, your habits have evolved, and your confidence has deepened. The person who once struggled with the same patterns begins to feel distant. That quiet realization marks the true success of the Stoic path. You did not change overnight. You simply practiced better choices day after day until the new version of yourself became real. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to evolve quietly while others stay stuck in the same place, repeating the same frustrations, chasing the same approval, and never quite breaking through? It's not talent, it's not luck, and it's definitely not that they have fewer problems than you. The real difference is much more uncomfortable than that. Some people decide, silently, to stop performing for the world and start mastering themselves, and others never do. Most people are exhausted, not because life is impossible, but because they are constantly reacting to opinions, reacting to comparisons, reacting to notifications, reacting to expectations that were never even theirs to begin with, and the more they react, the more scattered they become. The more scattered they become, the weaker they feel, and the weaker they feel, the louder they try to be. But the Stoics saw this pattern centuries ago. Marcus Aurelius didn't write reminders to impress anyone. He wrote to steady his own mind. Epictetus didn't teach control over others. He taught control over perception. Stoicism isn't about becoming cold or distant. It's about becoming internally anchored. It's about learning to focus on yourself so deeply that the noise of the world loses its grip. And if you value conversations grounded in Stoicism, psychology, and the pursuit of self-mastery, if you're not here just for motivation but for transformation, consider subscribing. not as a favor to me, but as a quiet commitment to yourself, a signal that you're choosing growth over noise, depth over distraction, and strength over approval. Have you ever noticed how loud the world has become? Not just in sound, but in thought, in expectation, in constant demand for your attention, as if every moment requires your reaction, your opinion, your presence, and your validation. And yet, by the end of the day, you feel exhausted, not because you built something meaningful, but because your mind has been pulled in 100 different directions that never truly belonged to you in the first place. Most people believe they are tired because life is difficult, but often they are tired because they are reacting too much, reacting to comments, reacting to comparisons, reacting to expectations, reacting to people who may not even think about them twice, and in that constant state of reaction, something fragile begins to form, a version of themselves built around external approval instead of internal strength. This is precisely where Stoicism becomes deeply relevant, not as a dramatic philosophy meant to detach you from life, but as a disciplined return to self-governance, a reminder that while the world will always be unstable, your inner world does not have to be equally chaotic if you choose to train it. Marcus Aurelius, one of the most powerful individuals of his time, spent his private moments writing reflections not to impress anyone or secure admiration, but to steady his own mind, reminding himself that external events are rarely under our control, while our interpretations always are, and that distinction alone reshapes how you experience reality, because it moves your focus away from managing perception and toward managing character. When you truly focus on yourself, something subtle but powerful begins to shift within you. As you stop chasing impressions and begin building discipline, you stop performing confidence and begin cultivating it quietly through repetition and integrity. Yet this shift does not feel comfortable at first, because focusing inward requires silence, and silence reveals things you may have avoided for years, such as how easily you are distracted, how much of your stress is rooted in comparison, and how frequently you speak or act simply to avoid being misunderstood. Carl Jung once observed that people will do almost anything to avoid facing their own souls, and while that statement may initially sound dramatic, it becomes surprisingly accurate when you observe your own habits, especially how quickly you reach for distraction the moment discomfort appears, how instinctively you seek reassurance when doubt surfaces, and how often you explain yourself not because clarity is needed, but because you fear the judgment that might arise in its absence. These patterns are not proof of weakness, but evidence of an untrained mind, and Stoicism at its core is a practice of mental training, a daily exercise in strengthening interpretation over impulse. Epictetus taught that we are disturbed not by events themselves, but by the meaning we assign to them. And this idea is transformative because interpretation shapes emotion, emotion shapes reaction, reaction shapes behavior, and behavior shapes identity over time. When you stop focusing on yourself, your identity becomes outsourced and dependent on external feedback, rising with praise and collapsing under criticism. But when you deliberately turn inward, your identity stabilizes because it is reinforced by your own actions rather than the opinions of others. You begin measuring your day differently, not by how many people approved of you, but by how aligned your behavior was with your principles, not by how visible you were, but by how consistent you remained when no one was watching. This kind of internal measurement is not glamorous, and it rarely draws attention, yet it is precisely why it creates strength, because Aristotle's idea that excellence is a habit rather than an isolated act means that your daily decisions, however small they may seem, gradually shape who you become. Neuroscience confirms what ancient philosophy intuitively understood, which is that repetition rewires the brain, strengthening neural pathways associated with discipline every time you choose focus over distraction, reinforcing self-control every time you resist impulse, and slowly sculpting a mind that operates with intention rather than reaction. Focusing on yourself in this way is not selfish but structural, because without internal order, external success becomes unstable, and you may achieve recognition or material progress, yet still feel unsettled because accomplishment without coherence does not create peace. Real peace emerges when your private habits align with your public identity, when your actions match your values consistently enough that your inner voice no longer contradicts your outward behavior. Silence becomes the training ground for this alignment, because when stimulation fades, your unresolved thoughts surface and your insecurities become visible. Yet this discomfort is not a threat, but an opportunity, since clarity is impossible without confrontation. When you sit long enough without distraction, your mind recalibrates and patterns become obvious, revealing where your energy leaks through unnecessary arguments, constant comparison, or endless attempts to manage how others see you. Viktor Frankl wrote that between stimulus and response, there exists a space in which our power to choose resides, and that space grows wider the more you practice inward focus, allowing you to respond with intention rather than reflex. As this practice deepens, you notice that your reactions slow and your emotional stability strengthens, because you are no longer driven by every external trigger, and instead of rushing to defend yourself, you evaluate whether defense is even necessary. Instead of competing with someone else's timeline, you return to your own process, and instead of explaining your standards, you live them quietly. Over time, you begin to crave progress more than praise, because praise fades quickly while progress compounds into confidence that does not depend on applause. Your motivation shifts from external validation to internal alignment, and your satisfaction comes from keeping promises to yourself rather than broadcasting your intentions. This shift creates a steadiness that others may notice but cannot easily disrupt, because it is built on repeated action rather than temporary emotion. Jung described the privilege of a lifetime as becoming who you truly are, and that becoming is less about dramatic reinvention and more about removing what weakens you, shedding habits that dilute your focus, and strengthening the relationship you have with your own mind. There may be friction along the way, because people who are accustomed to your old reactions may feel unsettled by your new calm. Yet focusing on yourself means accepting that not everyone will understand your path, and understanding from others is not a requirement for your growth. Gradually, the need for validation diminishes because your identity feels anchored, and when identity is anchored, you move differently, not louder but clearer, not aggressively but deliberately, with a presence shaped by coherence rather than performance. Stoicism does not promise a life free of difficulty, but offers a method for internal governance so that difficulty does not dismantle you. By protecting your attention, training your interpretations, and reinforcing discipline through daily repetition, you cultivate inner peace that does not rely on circumstance. This peace is not passive or detached, but active and resilient, rooted in the understanding that while the world will always be unpredictable, your response can remain steady if you commit to the practice of focusing on yourself consistently enough that it becomes your foundation rather than your occasional effort. Have you ever noticed how loud the world has become, not only in sound but in expectation, comparison, opinion, and constant demand for your reaction? As if every moment requires you to respond, explain, defend, or prove something about yourself. And yet, at the end of the day, you feel drained, not because you built something meaningful, but because your attention has been stretched thin across things that never truly strengthened you. Most people assume their exhaustion comes from effort, but very often it comes from fragmentation, from trying to manage how they are perceived instead of managing how they think, from chasing approval instead of cultivating stability, and from reacting to life instead of directing it. In that constant state of reaction, identity becomes unstable, because when your mood rises and falls with every external trigger, you begin to live at the mercy of circumstances rather than from a place of internal order. This is where Stoicism quietly becomes powerful, not as an abstract philosophy, but as a practical discipline of reclaiming attention and strengthening the inner world. Marcus Aurelius, despite ruling an empire, understood that true governance begins within, and his private writings reveal a man far more concerned with mastering his impulses than controlling events, because he recognized that external events are unpredictable, but interpretation is always within reach. That distinction reshapes how you move through life, since interpretation influences emotion, emotion shapes reaction, and reaction repeated over time becomes character. When you focus on yourself in the Stoic sense, you are not withdrawing from responsibility or ambition, but refining the lens through which you experience everything, and that refinement gradually builds clarity. Clarity does not arrive dramatically, nor does it announce itself with sudden inspiration. Instead, it forms slowly when you begin to examine your habits, your thoughts, and the subtle ways you give away your energy. You begin noticing how often a single comment lingers in your mind for hours, how quickly comparison alters your mood, how easily distraction becomes a substitute for self-reflection. Carl Jung observed that what we do not confront within ourselves will appear in our lives as fate, and this insight becomes tangible when you realize that the patterns you refuse to examine will quietly shape your decisions, your relationships, and your direction. Avoidance feels comfortable in the short term, but it compounds into confusion over time, because what is unexamined continues to operate beneath the surface. Focusing on yourself requires facing this internal landscape honestly, which can feel uncomfortable because silence exposes what distraction hides. When you remove constant stimulation, your mind does not immediately become peaceful. Instead, it becomes honest, revealing insecurities you have postponed addressing and doubts you have muted with busyness. Yet this honesty is not harmful. It is instructive because it shows you where growth is needed. Epictetus taught that no person is free who is not master of themselves, and mastery begins with awareness, with the ability to observe your impulses without obeying them automatically. Each time you pause before reacting, you widen the space between stimulus and response, and that widening creates freedom. Over time, this practice reshapes your nervous system because the brain adapts to repeated behavior, strengthening pathways associated with discipline when you consistently choose intention over impulse. Neuroscience supports what ancient philosophy practiced intuitively, demonstrating that the prefrontal cortex becomes more efficient when exercised through deliberate decision-making, and that emotional reactivity diminishes when you repeatedly refrain from acting on every surge of feeling. This biological reinforcement explains why discipline, once established, begins to feel less forced and more natural, as the mind becomes accustomed to steadiness. Aristotle's assertion that we are what we repeatedly do becomes more than a philosophical statement. It becomes a neurological reality. As this internal structure develops, you begin to measure success differently, not by visibility or recognition, but by alignment, by whether your actions reflect your principles consistently. Approval loses its power to destabilize you because your identity no longer depends on it. And criticism loses its sting because you evaluate it calmly rather than absorbing it emotionally. This does not mean you become indifferent or detached from feedback, but rather that you filter it through discernment, extracting what is useful and discarding what is not. Such discernment creates resilience because your sense of worth is grounded in behavior rather than opinion. Focusing on yourself also alters your relationship with ambition, since ambition without inner clarity often becomes comparison-driven and reactive, while ambition grounded in self-knowledge becomes purposeful and steady. You stop announcing every intention because you understand that speaking prematurely can create an illusion of progress, and instead you invest energy in systems that sustain growth quietly. Systems replace moods as the foundation of action, and rhythm replaces motivation as the driver of consistency. This shift may appear subtle from the outside, but internally it transforms how you experience effort, because effort no longer feels like a performance but like a practice. Viktor Frankl wrote that when we can no longer change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves, and this perspective becomes empowering when you recognize how much of your frustration stems from attempting to control what lies beyond your influence. By redirecting attention inward, you conserve energy previously spent on arguments, explanations, and validation, and that conserved energy becomes available for mastery. Mastery, in this context, is not dominance over others, but refinement of your own thinking, a steady sharpening of judgment and restraint. As weeks and months pass, you begin to notice a deeper calm emerging, not because life has become simpler, but because your reactions have become measured. You do not rush to respond to provocation, nor do you feel compelled to prove your worth through constant output, and this restraint builds a quiet confidence that is difficult to disturb. Jung described the journey toward wholeness as the integration of conscious and unconscious aspects of the self, and focusing inward gradually supports that integration by aligning thought, emotion, and behavior into coherence. Coherence feels powerful because it eliminates internal contradiction, allowing you to move through life with less friction between who you claim to be and who you act as. There will still be moments of doubt, moments when distraction feels tempting and when the old pattern of seeking reassurance resurfaces, yet the difference lies in your awareness of those impulses and your capacity to choose differently. Each time you choose differently, you reinforce your autonomy, and autonomy breeds confidence not dependent on applause. Over time, the need for external validation fades because the satisfaction of integrity surpasses the fleeting pleasure of praise. Your peace becomes self-generated, rooted in discipline rather than circumstance. Ultimately, focusing on yourself in this Stoic manner is an act of construction, a deliberate building of internal architecture strong enough to withstand external instability. It is not isolation but foundation, not withdrawal but refinement, not selfishness but responsibility. When your inner world is ordered, your outer actions carry greater clarity, and when your identity is reinforced through repeated alignment, your presence becomes steady rather than reactive. In a world that encourages constant noise and comparison, choosing to cultivate this inner steadiness may appear simple, yet it is profoundly transformative because it reclaims the one domain that has always been yours to govern, your own mind. As this inner steadiness begins to take shape, you start to recognize how much of your previous anxiety was tied to uncertainty about yourself rather than uncertainty about the world. The world has always been unpredictable, and it always will be. Yet what unsettled you most was not the chaos outside, but the instability inside. When your thoughts were inconsistent, when your standards shifted depending on who was present, when your behavior changed based on who was watching, you felt fragmented. That fragmentation creates tension because it divides your energy, forcing you to maintain different versions of yourself in different environments. Focusing on yourself eliminates that division by slowly aligning your inner values with your outward conduct so that you are no longer adapting your character to match each setting, but carrying the same grounded presence wherever you go. This alignment does not happen overnight because it requires you to identify what truly matters to you rather than what appears impressive to others. Many people confuse admiration with fulfillment, believing that being respected or envied will automatically produce peace. Yet admiration is unstable because it depends on comparison and perception, both of which are constantly shifting. Fulfillment, on the other hand, emerges from coherence, from knowing that your actions reflect your beliefs consistently. When your effort is guided by principle rather than applause, you become less susceptible to emotional turbulence, and this reduction in turbulence creates mental clarity that compounds over time. Mental clarity is not merely the absence of confusion, it is the presence of deliberate thought, the ability to examine a situation calmly without allowing emotion to dominate interpretation. The Stoics understood that clarity requires distance from impulse, and they practiced exercises of reflection to strengthen this distance. Seneca wrote about the importance of examining one's day each evening, reviewing actions not with harsh self-judgment but with constructive awareness, and this practice transforms mistakes into lessons rather than sources of shame. When you reflect consistently, you begin to see patterns in your reactions, recognizing triggers that previously felt automatic, and once a trigger is identified, it loses some of its power because awareness disrupts unconscious repetition. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow suggests that aspects of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge often influence our behavior most strongly, and focusing inward allows you to confront these hidden elements rather than projecting them outward. Instead of blaming others for every irritation, you begin asking whether your own expectations or insecurities contributed to your response. This does not mean you excuse harmful behavior from others, but it means you examine your internal landscape honestly before reacting, which preserves your energy and sharpens your judgment. Over time, this honest examination builds emotional maturity, because maturity is not the absence of emotion, but the ability to regulate it intelligently. As emotional regulation strengthens, you notice that your interactions change subtly. Conversations feel less defensive because you are no longer protecting a fragile identity, and disagreements feel less threatening because your sense of self is not tied to being right. You listen more attentively, speak more intentionally, and allow silence to exist without discomfort. Silence becomes a sign of control rather than weakness, because you understand that not every thought requires expression and not every criticism demands a rebuttal. This restraint conserves mental energy, and conserved energy becomes available for deeper focus. Focus, when cultivated deliberately, transforms productivity from frantic effort into structured momentum. Instead of working in bursts driven by motivation, you rely on rhythm built through consistent habits, and rhythm reduces the emotional volatility that often disrupts progress. Aristotle's insight that excellence is formed through repeated action gains practical meaning here, because when your days are structured around disciplined routines, you eliminate the constant negotiation with yourself about whether to act. Action becomes expected rather than debated, and this predictability strengthens confidence in your own reliability. Reliability toward yourself is one of the most underestimated sources of inner peace. When you repeatedly follow through on commitments, even small ones, you begin to trust your own word, and this trust reduces anxiety because you no longer question whether you will act according to your intentions. Self-trust creates stability, and stability reduces the impulse to seek external reassurance. As this self-trust deepens, external praise feels pleasant but unnecessary, and criticism feels informative rather than destabilizing. You become less reactive not because you suppress emotion, but because your foundation is secure. Viktor Frankl emphasized that meaning arises from responsibility, from choosing your response even when circumstances are difficult, and focusing on yourself aligns with this principle because it places responsibility back in your hands. Instead of waiting for conditions to improve before strengthening your character, you strengthen your character within existing conditions, which gradually alters how you experience those conditions. Challenges remain, yet your perception of them shifts from threat to training, and this shift reduces fear because fear thrives on helplessness, while responsibility restores agency. Agency does not guarantee success, but it guarantees growth, and growth sustained over time compounds into capability. Capability then replaces insecurity as the dominant influence in your decisions, because you know from experience that you can adapt and improve. This knowledge builds resilience, which is not loud or dramatic but steady and composed. Resilient individuals do not deny hardship, but they interpret it as temporary and manageable rather than catastrophic. This interpretation stabilizes emotion and supports rational decision-making even under pressure. As you continue focusing inward, you may notice that your tolerance for superficial engagement decreases, not out of arrogance but out of clarity. You become more selective about where you invest attention because you understand its value, and this selectivity is not isolation but prioritization. You value depth over noise, substance over spectacle, and alignment over impression. These preferences shape your environment gradually as you gravitate toward relationships and activities that reinforce growth rather than distraction. The cumulative effect of these changes is subtle yet profound as your identity transitions from reactive to deliberate. You no longer chase every opportunity simply because it promises recognition, nor do you avoid challenges out of fear of judgment. Instead, you evaluate opportunities based on alignment with your values, and you accept challenges as exercises in discipline. This measured approach reduces regret because decisions are guided by principle rather than impulse. Over time, your sense of peace becomes less dependent on outcomes and more rooted in effort. You may still pursue ambition, but ambition becomes an extension of your values rather than a substitute for self-worth. When success arrives, it feels like a reflection of consistent practice rather than a surprise that must be defended. When failure occurs, it feels like feedback rather than identity collapse. This balanced response to both success and failure reflects the essence of Stoic resilience. The world will remain unpredictable, and external validation will continue to fluctuate, but your internal steadiness grows more reliable with each disciplined choice. Focusing on yourself in this way is not a temporary strategy, but a lifelong practice of refinement, a commitment to strengthening the only domain you can truly govern. As this practice continues, the noise of comparison fades, the urgency of reaction diminishes, and what remains is a quiet confidence rooted in self-mastery. That confidence does not need to be displayed to be real, because it is reinforced daily through alignment, reflection, and deliberate action, forming a foundation strong enough to carry you through uncertainty with clarity and composure. In the end, the world will keep moving, opinions will keep forming, and noise will never truly disappear, but your peace was never meant to depend on silence outside of you. It was meant to be built within you. Every time you choose discipline over distraction, clarity over chaos, and alignment over approval, you are shaping a mind that cannot be easily shaken. That is real strength. That is real freedom. And that is the path of Stoicism. Thank you for being part of Psychresto Mind. If this message spoke to something steady inside you, don't stop here. There's another video on the screen that will help you go even deeper into building mental resilience and unshakable focus. Watch that next and continue strengthening the foundation you're building.